complex social and political landscapes and how far the field has come and where it's headed. So we hope not only do you join us and engage today, and feel free to use the chat to engage with peers and all of our team, but also join us for future sessions. Our next one will be coming up on May 20th. Organizing to Win 20 Years of Youth Power. So we hope you'll come back. It'll be at the same time, 11 p.m. Eastern. And then for those of you that have registered for Equity to Win, Health Equity at the Center, our specific report on youth at the forefront of health justice, that one had a date in June, and we're potentially moving it to August or September. So please look out for that. And with that, happy to be here with you all. Please continue to introduce yourself in the chat, and I'm going to kick it over to Eric.
Hey everybody, great to be with you all today. I'm Eric Braxton, he, him. I am proud to be a co-director of FCYO with Monica, and definitely feeling like some smoky barbecue sauce today, I'm thinking, on the intro question, but I've been appreciating all of your answers as well. So yeah, great to have you all here. So, you know, as Monica says, this is the first in a series that we're going to be doing of looking back at 20 years of funding for youth organizing. And we've just released our report, Investing in the Power of Young People, 20 Years of Philanthropic Support for Youth Organizing, written by Seema Shah, who is here with us today to share some of the findings. And this report really looks at what have been the ebbs and flows of funding for youth organizing over the last 20 years. And anybody who's been around that work knows that there have been some ebbs and flows. And we're excited to have more data than we've ever had before about how much money is going to the field, where it's going, and how this relates to other fields, and what is it actually going to take to provide the resources that young people need to be leading this critical work across the country. So, you know, our agenda for today, we're going to start out with a conversation with a few key funders who have been supporting this work to get their perspective on how funding for youth organizing has changed and what's really needed in this moment. Then we'll hear from Seema Shah, the author of the report, about some of the key findings there. And then finally, we at FCYO will share some of our critical lessons and recommendations for funders in particular after 20 years of supporting this work. We'll hope to get some time to answer your questions and thoughts throughout. Use the chat. The chat's a good way for us to stay engaged. So we'd love for you to keep sharing your thoughts and questions and what you want to get out of this. So yeah, please drop your questions in the chat. And then I just want to note that our conversation today is going to be really focused on funders some and about funding. And we could have done this session just as a funder brief for funders only. But in FCYO's spirit, you know, we really believe in the importance of bringing funders and youth organizers together to strategize about how to strengthen and resource this work. And so we think it's really important that we need funders and organizers together. And so this session is going to focus some on conversations with funders about funding, but our next session coming up in May is really going to focus on youth leaders and youth organizers and their work over the last couple of years. So with that, I'm excited to get us started for this conversation. And I will kick it back to Monica to introduce our panel, our conversation with funders.
Thank you, Eric. And we have a really amazing set of funders that are joining us today. I am quite honored to not only be in their presence and help facilitate this conversation today, but I also get the privilege of working with many of them quite closely. They all have been or are on the FCYO board. So we're really appreciative of their, not only their dedication to the field, but their dedication to our efforts. Well, and they have really beautiful bios that I'm not going to read the whole of, but we will drop the full bios in the chat if folks want to read a little bit more about each one of them. We'll start with Lori. So as president of the Edward W. Hazen Foundation, Lori Bazzalar leads a national grant-making program supporting organizing and leadership by young people and communities of color to dismantle structural inequities based on race and class. Lori, welcome. Next, we have Nat. As executive director, Nat Chokie Williams leads the Hill Snowden Foundation in its philanthropic and programmatic work, operations and partnerships within community. Nat's funding experience has focused on community organizing and youth organizing, and his background includes research on social political development of African American youth, activists, social movements, social oppressions, and liberation psychology. Welcome, Nat. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two other panelists. We'll start, folks, with a conversation with Lori and Nat, but I'm going to run through all the bios now just for folks to know. Next, we'll have Albert Maldonado, a senior program manager with the statewide power team of the California Endowment. Albert Maldonado plays a leadership role in the organization's cross-cutting youth power and youth development grant-making strategy. And then, last but not least, Sanji Rao is the director of the Ford Foundation Civic Engagement and Government Program, which seeks to strengthen representation, participation, and leadership in U.S. democracy so that communities have the capacities to shape their futures, animated by principles of dignity, inclusion, and fairness. So welcome you all, and so excited to have you. And because this is an opportunity for us to, really look back at the history, I'd like to start with an opening question that Lori, you and Nat can both take some time to reflect on. So just please, help us get started by sharing a little bit about the history of the field of youth organizing and the role philanthropy played in supporting its growth. And Lori, we'll kick it to you to start us off.
Okay, thank you, Monica. And thanks everyone for joining us for this conversation. It's kind of interesting to be thinking about this work at a time where, just our lives are so different, and to be thinking about it retrospectively. The 20-year horizon that we're talking about is one in which there was huge development and increased sophistication and power in youth organizing. But of course, we all know that youth organizing has been going on forever, where as long as there have been young people, there have been young people coming together to change the conditions of their lives. And so, I think that in my speaking about it today, I'm really talking about the time that we sort of recognize as a field, youth organizing. So, from the Hazen Foundation perspective, we had started funding a variety of different kinds of youth leadership programs, but then started to identify programs where young people were using the tools of organizing and developing a political analysis and identity, and really, doing things that challenged the hierarchy and power structures in order to make substantive changes in their communities and their schools, et cetera. I will say one of the early groups was founded by now FCYO director, Eric Braxton, Philly Student Union. He and another kid came along and said, this isn't working, and what can we do to make it better for not just ourselves, but for our peers and friends. I think that I'm just going to say that because in some ways that is emblematic to me of young people coming up in the work and then taking leadership roles. Monica Cordova herself, also the co-director at FCYO, started as a young person, organizing herself and moving up and into this current role. And the reason I think that's important is because when I think about the trajectory of the work, it's about the young people in the present, building their agency, building their efficacy, understanding the political and social conditions that they're encountering. And I think that what I've observed has been that there has been a real attention to that by both the adults involved and the young people's desire to take a hold of that, right? Now, for funding, on the funding side, that's, I'm not going to spend a lot of time so much about the field, because I know we want to talk about what was the sort of intersection of funding and the field. And it seems to me that it was a while before institutional philanthropy understood why and how to engage with youth organizing groups. And there were two real sort of groups of funders that we were trying real hard to get to. And I will say that, I would say there were two institutions that actually had explicitly announced programs to support youth organizing. One was at the Hazen Foundation, and I have to compliment Barbara Tavares, who was the president at the time, and at Cerna Foundation, and Robert Sherman, who was the program director at the time. And I think I saw, Robert, that you're on the call, so shout out to Robert. But other than that, we were thinking about, like, how do we engage youth development funders and how do we engage social justice funders? And some of the barriers to that were really annoying, frankly. The youth development funders needed proof that this actually met youth development objectives. And I'm sure Nat, who did amazing work to paint that picture quantitatively, qualitatively, can speak to that. But it had limited effectiveness, frankly, because I think, and discomfort with the questions around power. Social justice funders were like, they're kids, they can't even vote. There was this like ageism thing that was really annoying because, as we all know, social movements start with young people. Young people center the leadership of those movements so enormously. So, it was a lot of work. I think that what's happened over time, because we have seen these ups and downs, right, is that individuals and institutions who have some predilection to the work or some understanding for a variety of reasons may pick it up in their portfolio. So a program officer, right, for a variety of reasons will say, this is important. But I don't think that it became actually articulated as a focus of major funding programs until much more recently. And I think that some of that is because of the work of young people. We can't turn our backs and pretend we don't see the really important work that young people do around gun violence, around immigration reform, around housing, around education, climate justice, all of these issues, right? Plus, I think in general, the understanding around race in this country and how young people really are grappling with it in far more sophisticated ways than adults are. And so I think that started to bring forth a greater sort of engagement from the foundation community. But rather than go into a lot of detail, I'll pass it to Nat. Okay, Monica, is that good?
Yes, please. Nat, we'd love to hear your reflections.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for having me on today. It's great to be here with so many of you, and shout out to so many people. I can't even go through it right now, but shout out to so many people. Well, let me just say, looking back 20 years, and I've been in philanthropy for about 21 years or so, and I literally grew up as a funder within the Funders Club for Youth Organizing. I started in philanthropy at the New York Foundation as a program officer there. My first funder meeting in about 2 weeks after I started my job was with FCYO. People say in the organizing world, I cut my teeth. I don't know what that actually means, but I cut my teeth as a youth organizing funder and developed my own leadership and voice as a young program officer through FCYO, and it directly led to me getting my current job as the executive director of the Hill Snowden Foundation. And I learned the value and the practice of funder organizing through FCYO, which serves me today. So I really do see FCYO as being like this kind of core feature, this core training ground for me in my work, just like youth organizing is a core ground, a core vehicle, and a core body of practice for young people to realize their own leadership, to realize their own voice, and to make the changes that they want to see in the world today. And so, 20 years ago, I guess one of the, as Laurie said, youth organizing has been around since the dawn of time and all that. But 20 plus years ago, in California, there was organizing around Prop 21, the kind of youth criminalization bill in California. And that really did start to catalyze not just a vision and practice for young people coming together, but really, because they were always coming together, it started to catalyze funders actually recognizing young people moving forward a policy agenda in organizing. And so that was in part helped to lay the foundation for the birth of what would become FCYO. And so there was a great deal of excitement and enthusiasm among a small but committed group of funders nestled in and around FCYO, committed to advancing and resourcing the at that time kind of burgeoning field of youth organizing. And there was always tremendous power and energy and action from youth organizers and youth organizing groups and young people across the country that was really grounded in their own power and their realization of their power. And I do credit FCYO with making youth organizers, helping to make youth organizers a distinct and respected field within the philanthropic space. But this took years and years and years of persistence and strategy and dedication, often in the face of disappointment. But we had a deep belief that the prospects of achieving a just and equitable country would rise or fall on the realized power of young people, particularly youth facing racial, social, gender, environmental, economic inequities and oppression. So the FCYO board and staff, again, we were kind of committed to figuring out how to lift up youth organizing as a veritable field. But as I said, this was a hard road. Lori mentioned youth development. We were kind of targeting these two bodies, youth development funders and social justice funders. And, you know, I kept thinking about like Oliver Twist, like this one scene from Oliver Twist, and I was thinking about my thing today. It's like, you know, we were walking around with our hands out like, please, sir, can I have some more? You know, I mean, it was just like this constant like place of both supplication, but also trying to twist and fit ourselves within the philanthropic lens or gaze that currently existed so that they could hopefully see or glimpse what youth organizing as important, while the youth organizers themselves already realized they were important. They already realized that they had power and vitality. And so there was this tension in the earlier days of us trying to figure out how we could cut the work to make it palatable for philanthropy, but youth organizers and young people realizing that they had their own power and that they needed to do the work, not cut the work to make it reasonable or respectable for other folks. And so being one of the folks that was on the kind of responsible for helping to raise the funds within the FCYO, I was co-chair for I don't know how many years. It might have been 6, 7, 8. I'm not sure how long I was the co-chair for FCYO, but the outreach to positive youth development and group funders and to social justice funders, and then it also expanded into kind of cutting up the pie into smaller and smaller chunks. So initially, FCYO started out by doing general support re-granting. We had about $300,000 budget a year. We would, give general support grants to youth organizer funders, youth organizer groups. But as that money got harder to raise, we started adopting this approach of special initiatives. So starting with the Roots initiative around capacity building, then into regenerations, kind of tapping into environmental justice, and then looking at what was the next one? I think we did a leadership pipeline, we did healthy communities, we did all these things, right? And each one of them was trying to make the case within a particular field for youth organizing. And at the same time, it started to kind of divide up the pie a little bit more in terms of who was actually looking for us. And so I think one of the big shifts, and I'm going to stop talking in a second, but one of the big shifts happened around 2009, 2010, when the Dreamers were pushing their vision, undocumented and unafraid, basically pushing their power so that they could have the type of respect, dignity, and security they could have as residents in the United States, right? And pushed and moved and changed and captured the entirety of the immigration reform kind of enterprise and movement and consciousness at that time. And that was one of the times where I really do see this shift starting happening from this place of kind of more supplication around trying to make the case why youth organizing is important, to actual evidence, to actual people realizing, because of the power of young people, that youth organizing was essential to achieving the progressive ambition, the most kind of noble and highest progressive ambitions of this country. And that continued after that, shortly thereafter, after the murder of Trayvon Martin, with Dream Defenders and other young people organizing around that, which then blossomed into the Black Lives Matter movement and all the racial justice work that's going forward, in addition to all the other work that youth organizers are doing. So the thing that I just want to end by saying is that I think the progression over the last 20 years has been one where folks have been really doing the work to make the case that youth organizing, young people's power was essential. And that was often met with a range of kind of disbelief or disregard. And then it was when and as young people asserted their power in that space that I think it started to become an undeniable part of the core infrastructure, youth organizing towards progressive change in this country. And FCYO strategy, I think, evolved with that too. The current theory of change that focuses on youth power recognizes that, finds a space and creates a space for funders to see their own interests, but within a broader frame that is grounded in the power of youth organizing as a core infrastructure for progressive movements in this country. So I'm going to stop there.
You know, one thing I just want to add to that, Nat, because I think you really summarized it well. But I do think that one of the things that as I'm listening to you, even though, like, yes, I agree with all that, but like one of the things that we're not saying, which is that for the most part, for large part, not entirely, we're mostly talking about like national and regional funders in that era, right? So one of the things that tends to be really difficult for youth organizing groups is that they are challenging power structures in their communities. And very often local funding community is comprised of people who either are in or connected to those power structures, right? So that has been a real challenge. And it means that particularly in places where those power structures are, very racially defined or something like, I'm thinking about groups that we know that we funded in Mississippi or in smaller towns in parts of the country in Kansas that don't have a progressive funding infrastructure. It is very difficult for those groups to access resources locally. And then they have the challenge of not being big enough for most national funders to see or understand how to engage with, right? It's difficult for a national funder for a variety of reasons to see them, just to know what's out there. So that's number one. But then the other thing is for large foundations to manage the size of grants that we used to say that they could absorb, but I would now say that we are willing to entrust them with, right? That we made these decisions about how young people can be in leadership in organizations and our comfort level with them having large amounts of money. And frankly, I think we've disabled their ability to grow and scale to the kind of power that they strive for. And that was a little bit of a tangent, but just to say that, that creates a dilemma. I do think that FCYO has helped to answer that dilemma by creating a vehicle that funders who make larger grants can be comfortable making grants to, because first of all, you're aggregating risk. It's like an insurance company, right? If one grant to one little organization goes bad, you're not going to have to explain that up the chain in your bureaucracy. You've got FCYO, the vast majority of the work is going, quote, well, defined by whatever metrics or, sort of the way that you think about your work in your institution. And also, they can absorb, again, using those kinds of ideas, which I would challenge, frankly, but the idea that FCYO is able to do that and then distribute the funds in ways that support the work that you're trying to accomplish. So that's just one other little piece of it. I do think I still, we've been working in the past couple of years trying to think about like who's missing. Obviously, Native youth, very few resources going there. Rural communities, it's a huge issue getting money to rural communities where young people are doing work. It may not be, you're not going to get a meeting with the kind of numbers you would in Chicago. There just aren't that many young people in a town of 10,000 people, right? But it's still powerful and important work that should be resourced. So all of those kinds of questions, I think, FCYO helps create a structure that I think the funding community has been able to make use of, in addition to being a learning space and everything that you mentioned, Matt.
Right. Yeah, no, I think.
Yeah, can I just, so we're gonna, we'll need to transition to our other colleagues, Albert and Sanjeev in a second, but I, feel free to say what you're gonna say, but also wondering, Nat, Lori just laid out a bunch of really beautiful points about the kind of critical need in particular areas and some of the gaps that we're seeing. And I'm also wondering if you want to layer in, you saw that, you highlighted 2010 as a pivotal moment. Last year was also like a pivotal moment. So for funders that were coming to an awakening, last year, like what are also your additional like thoughts, recommendations for them just to like jump in and support this work? Like,
right. Yeah. Well, what I was trying to say in 2000, right? That was, if we go by decades, right, to some degree. In 2000, there was this kind of initial onset of small section of philanthropy saying, wow, we have to really understand and lift up the work that young people are doing because this is powerful. Fast forward 10 years, we have a national example of that continued to build over that decade. And I'm not saying culminating because it's still going to be rising, right? But the example of last year with the largest, not just racial justice uprisings, the largest protest movement in this country's history, right? Fueled by young people every day. It's not just the largest, it's also the longest happening, right? And so, I think the thing that people hopefully will realize is that as we are faced with more and more kind of regressive entrenchment, because the Trump era and white nationalism and white supremacy has not gone away. It's changing in different ways. We need to have folks who are bold and brave and will put themselves on the line, for that, and not compromise, to be unapologetic, right? And that may scare some people. That definitely may scare some people when we talk about risk, but it's only because of that risk that largely young people are making that we have the opportunity to see the advances, to live out and hopefully dream about where we can actually get to, right? And so so there's the kind of concrete examples of quote wins that come from youth organizing, but more importantly is this cultural shift that the power and the vision and the boldness and the direction of youth has always generated. That's what we really need to kind of get on. And so, a lot of the work that I've been doing more recently has been focusing on pushing Black-led organizing, Black-led movement as a kind of, again, fundamental part of the infrastructure for progressive movements in this country. And I say that regardless of what you're funding, regardless of what your issues, where you are, that there's always a need, there's always a reason to support Black-led organizing within your space. The same exact argument is true for youth organizing. Regardless of the issue that you're looking at, regardless of where you are, to Lori's point, there is a fundamental need to support the development and the power of young people to move forward an agenda for change. Because without that, then like I said before, we either rise, we fall, or we stay the same based on the ability for young people to lead us.
beautiful. Thank you. Thank you both. I wish we had like another hour. This is just getting really, really juicy. I would hope, folks, if you have questions for Nat or Lori, I don't know if I told them that I was going to tee them up to do this, but You know, here we are. Me throwing curveballs at them. Please drop your questions in the chat, and I think that they could probably spend some time between them and our FCYO team engaging with folks in the chat, because we're probably not going to have time for questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Nat.
Thank you, Monica, and the whole FCYO team. Bye.
We're going to bring in Albert and Sanjeev because we want to continue this conversation. So we know understanding that arc of history is so critical. But also us, you know, for those of us that are trying to determine your path, your institution's path into funding this work, it's also helpful to hear the stories and experiences from other peers in the field. So welcome, Sanjeev, welcome, Albert, like, so great to see you both. So would just love to hear, you know, the journey story of your institution and why you decided to include young people as a critical part of your strategy. And Albert, would you like to kick us off?
Sure thing, Monica. So first of all, let me just say thank you for having me here. And what an incredible opportunity to kind of, you know, build on the conversation from Nat and Lori a second ago. So let me introduce myself, Albert Maldonado, he, him, his. I'm with the California Endowment. And I think part of, I think kind of coming into this conversation, you know, where we're reflecting on the last 2 decades, I'll kind of use 2010 as a marker for the endowment. So the endowment is a statewide health foundation. Our emphasis has been on building healthy communities, and we launched a 10-year campaign which just sunsetted this last year, called Building Healthy Communities. And one of our core drivers of change in the body of work we prioritized was youth leadership. We didn't really know what that meant, you know, in great deal, but knew that we really wanted to engage young people as change makers. And so really right out the gate, one of the first calls we made was to FCYO. We had heard about the organization. We had, you know, read all of the briefs and had, you know, known folks that had, you know, recommended to us that we talk to FCYO. And really the emphasis for us was to learn from the field, right? As a health foundation, we were really intrigued by engaging young people in addressing the social determinants of health, right? Not one particular issue, as Nat was saying, but from schools to justice reinvestment to climate, really thinking about how do we position our young people for success, right? In the spirit of investing to win. And so really what we learned is you've got to invest in strong organizations. You have to, you know, really build out infrastructure so that those pathways for young people to engage are there, right? How do you support leadership development? How do you support voice? How do you support the behind the scenes opportunities for young people to really have that capacity? And one of the emphasis from, you know, with FCYO, and we kind of heard about it a second ago, was build capacity and infrastructure where it doesn't exist, right? What Lori was referring to in rural areas and in other parts of the state, in California in particular, we felt like there's, you know, evidence of strength in terms of youth power in the Bay Area and in Southern California. Again, knowing that at the time, a lot of these groups were vulnerable, they you know, didn't have multiple funding streams. How do we solidify, you know, the Bay Area LA orgs at the same time, intentionally building power where it doesn't exist in parts of California, i.e. the Central Valley, the Inland Empire. And so we really took an intentional approach at building local and statewide power. We really, and the statewide, you know, emphasis for us was how do we, you know, support communities that may be, you know, fighting for justice, right? When we think about a community like Bakersfield, they have some of the highest violence in the state, some of the poorest health outcomes amongst communities of color. And yet at the local level, there's just no possibility to advance change, where you leverage some of that in Sacramento and you're able to kind of, you know, advance statewide efforts. So for us, I think, you know, really the emphasis on building sustainable infrastructure, innovating, and really tapping into the brilliance and the bravery of young people. I think what Nat was saying earlier in terms of young people, right, just the capacity to speak truth to power, right? Like the capacity to see beyond the barriers. And what we've learned in the last 10 years is that our young people are some of the most innovative change makers in the state. It's also, I just want to be clear though, we see youth organizing as part of an intergenerational power building strategy. So it's not exclusively young people. It's really about how do we create the spaces for power to kind of power partners to really come together. So I think I'll end on this last thought, because Sanjeev certainly has a lot, and we've learned a lot from our partners at Ford as well. The one thing I want to say is that I'm also particularly proud of our organization in that we not only talked about funding our external partners, but our president and CEO also launched our President's Youth Council. And we've had a youth council now for going on 10 years. And the work has emerged beyond just our president and CEO to now intentional efforts with our board about what does a true and authentic partnership between the board and the PYC look like. So we're wrestling with that now. We're dealing with the tensions. We're dealing with, some of the traditional adultism and staff, kind of stuff that we're working through. So it's not perfect. It's iterative, and but we're proud of the fact that that's happening. And on that note, I just want to give Lupe Renteria, she's here with us today. She's our pre-YC fellow. Just a shout out. I mean, it's really about making sure that we're, always in partnership together. And so I think that's another reflection. Sanjeev, I certainly have a lot more to say, but I want to create the space for you to kind of chime in here.
And Sanjeev, I'd love to I once had a dear friend at a big national philanthropic institution tell me as I was banging my head up against a wall about supporting youth organizing, you can't turn a big ship fast. So I'd love to hear about Ford's journey, how turning that big ship and challenges and opportunities.
Thanks, Monica. Thanks, Albert. Thanks to all of you for offering your time. There's so many mentors and people I've learned from on this call. Just good to be in space with you, and just appreciate a few minutes to reflect. And I know I'm the last person who stands between this conversation and hearing about the fund scan from SEMA. So definitely we'll try and keep my comments focused. For those who don't know, or who don't know me, my name is Sanjeev Rao, he, him, his. I'm the director of the Civic Engagement and Government Program at Ford, as Monica mentioned. Ford is a large legacy foundation, been around for over 80 years, based here in New York, and we also have offices around the world. And I offer that because that's part of our story here in terms of supporting youth organizing. One of the things I wanted to, so I started at the foundation in 2012 under what was then the education program. And we didn't really have an explicit focus on youth organizing. We were funding education organizing, which included some, youth organizing as well through a donor collaborative. So part of the journey story, I mean, in the interest of time, I'll just focus on the journey that we've been on over the last 8 or 9 years while I've been at the foundation. Although Ford was one of the, original funders of FCYO 20 years ago, following the leads of Nat and Robert and Lori and others. So for us, there were a few things that really helped us make the case for centering young people in our strategy over these last 8 or 9 years. One, part of it was just getting the right people in grant-making seats, right? And I'm really grateful that this is not just a call for funders, but it's also people in the field, because I think this is relevant to both. I came out of teaching and education, but I also came of age learning from young organizers and multi-generational organizing in California, especially as a college student during the Rodney King police brutality trial and verdict, and in an era of anti-immigrant, anti-young people policymaking in California. So that really shaped my own thinking about young people and their leadership. So part of it's getting the right people in philanthropy. I think part of it is a deep reading of civil rights and social movement history, right? Where young people have always been at the center or the tip of the spear of progressive social change, and just making that case over and over again. Part of it's also understanding the research, right? What young people need to be successful in school and life and work and in community is an integrated sense of agency, identity, and learning. And, when I came into the education conversation in philanthropy, that was a huge part of how we needed to frame support for youth organizing. And also part of it was understanding, and Nat alluded to this as well, part of understanding the limits or limitations of education and youth development philanthropy, right? It's not just about programs and technical solutions, but structural racism and long-term oppression are social and cultural dynamics. And so when those things are in play, you have to do more to center people, not issues, right? So for us at Ford, we had a couple of choice points that really both helped us in moving toward youth organizing, but also created some obstacles or challenges. One was just the shift to inequality as the North Star for Ford across our programs, along with the 5 drivers of inequality that we put together internally as a shared framework for how we think about our grant making. That created more space for us to put forward a people-centered strategy. And, you know, at the program staff level, right, program officers, directors, and not just in the US, but across the world, there was really a shared kind of unanimity from program staff that youth organizing, young people's agency had to be part of every approach and every issue we worked on. Now, that wasn't necessarily a view that was shared by leadership necessarily, so we had a lot of work to do to socialize that. But the strength of having that kind of consensus at the program level was super important. You know, under our current president, Darren, you know, we've really shifted to a problem-solving frame for our grant making. And in some ways that's been helpful. It's been a way to help us have more focus in our work. And it also allowed us to sort of paint the story of the journey, right? From issue like education to context, youth opportunity, to people, young people and their leadership. And so, you know, to be honest, part of that journey was accidental and part of it was intentional. But you got to learn from your mistakes and be intentional about when you see space, right? So the last few things I'll say, there were certainly challenges. We had and still have leadership that doesn't come out of organizing or is necessarily deeply influenced by youth organizing. That's not necessarily a problem. It just means we have to do our own internal power mapping and figuring out like what are the messages, who are the messengers, to influence the people that will help set the conditions for us to do our grant making. And one of the biggest challenges was overcoming the mental model that organizing and youth organizing is a means to some other end, right? It's too process focused rather than outcomes focused. But our argument was, it's actually essential not only to good solutions, but to making sure those solutions are durable, right? If you have a bad process with a good outcome, it's unlikely to be durable. And youth organizing is part of that durability strategy. And so I guess I'll just close by saying, we have been able to maintain some of our commitments to this work despite all the changes of recent years and the political context, partly because under Darren's leadership, we've moved to multi-year general operating support. And so for us to give a 5-year significant size grant to FCYO for its core operations and to support their grant making has been, I hope, helpful for the field, but it's also been really helpful for us. It gives us a longer runway to learn and socialize in the foundation. And it means we have to make the case in a different way. We don't have to make the case every year to our leadership around why we're doing this. We have a 5-year strategy, right? So that's a depth of commitment. It's sometimes bumpy. We joke that it took us 5 years to come up with a 4-year strategy. So, it's not always easy in terms of moving a big ship. But we hope that it's helped us do what good leadership and philanthropy should do, right? Set direction, maintain commitment, and then support grantees in adapting to those challenges. I know I should wrap up, but I'll just say that, the impacts this is really like a quadruple bottom line investment, youth organizing, right? It helps individuals, organizations, campaigns, and movements. And, we all collectively have to both learn how to talk about that and then to talk about it explicitly in the field and in our institutions. And, this is probably one of the last sessions where I'll be able to speak like this about FCYO, because in terms of my own role, Ford is on term limits. I'm terming out later this fall. And so a big part of my job is to make sure that the value and impact of this work is embedded for my successor and the team that he'll be leading. And also just continue to be a champion and an ambassador for groups like FCYO and youth organizing more broadly, regardless of what seat I'm in, right? That's life work, not just Ford work. So I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for the opportunity to ramble.
No, that was, again, like we could have spent a whole half day between Lori and Nat and the two of you. Albert, I mean, Sanjeev spoke to just now a little bit about the work of also organizing philanthropy, right? And how to bring our peers and colleagues along. We're pretty close to being over time for this session, but wondering if you have like 1 to 2 minutes of reflections on what is the role of philanthropy? What do you see your role moving forward? Like, how do we you know, what are we called to do?
Yeah, thank you, Monica. A couple of quick thoughts on this, and I thought Nat, really hit it on the head earlier when he talked about learning how to organize within philanthropy in the FCYO space. And I feel like that's also one of the big learnings that we've had. And what the way that we've applied that here in California, a couple of different ways, right? So one, we want to be, good partners on a national level, but acknowledging our limitations as a statewide funder. We've organized with funders here in Southern California to really come together to really think about deeper investments over a longer period of time, as Sanjeev laid out amongst our youth organizing partners. And we've done the same in the Bay Area in terms of establishing a Northern California regional fund. Again, benefiting youth organizing groups' long-term capacity is our goal. But I'm also particularly excited about the maturing of the youth organizing field and partnerships within California. So for two particular ones that I really want to lift up, right? So Prop 64, which was the marijuana, legalizing marijuana and then applying the surplus funds towards broadly community development. So many of our organizing partners, our youth organizing partners, went in there and fought for those resources to go towards youth development, to go towards youth organizing groups. So you're actually seeing a kind of full circle of those resources under the guise of, repair around the war on drugs, especially of communities here in California. A new emerging partnership. We've heard from our young people for a long time that we can't just social justice our way out of our problems, but how do we also build a job strategy? So, we're partnering with the state workforce and with community colleges across the state in creating an earn and learn program so that social justice organizing is a pathway, is creating jobs. So I think it really is about how do you as an organization and institution leverage your partnership opportunities in support of what our young people are telling us, right? Like, so really authentically listening to the needs of our young people, forging new partnerships, establishing new revenue streams, and really redefining like what public investment means to a lot of our youth organizing groups. So those are a couple of quick reflections. Monica, I don't know if that's within the 2-minute window, but I think those are just some quick thoughts that come to mind.
Thank you, Albert. And Sanjeev, I mean, you made mention you're transitioning from the Ford Foundation soon. Any last parting thoughts around your vision for this work?
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah, and really, it's been one of my greatest privileges to be able to not just make grants to FCYO, but to sit at that table to learn. I mean, as Nat mentioned, right, like part of how I, developed as a program officer, as a grant maker, was because of the kinds of tables FCYO sets. So, I guess I would just say that, transitions and I actually believe in term limits, right? I mean, these transitions are actually good things. We need to have different people in these seats. And, my hope is that both the program officer I'm recruiting now and the director who takes my place comes out of these traditions, ideally. And if not, they're well positioned to think about youth organizing as just a fundamental cornerstone building block for whatever the strategy, right, might be as foundation strategies shift. But that this just has to be a cornerstone of any approach, any goal, any problem they're trying to solve. Youth organizing has to be part of it. And that's a big part of what I think my job is between now and helping my successor step in. So, that's part of our job, is to pass it forward and embed the work as much as we can. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. So beautiful. And thank you to Nat and Lori. Looking forward to many more conversations like this soon. And I'll pass it over to Eric. Again, folks, if you have any reflections or questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And Eric.
All right. Thanks so much, Monica. And thank you to all of the speakers right now. Really great to hear from all of you. We want to move on now to hearing a little bit about the report itself. We spent a long time over the last couple of years trying to collect as much data as we could about where is funding actually going to youth organizing, what has happened over these last couple of years. That's not easy data to get necessarily. So we were thrilled to have on board Seema Shah. So Seema is the founder and principal of Comveda Consulting. And her career spans 2 decades in the academic, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors. She's trained as a clinical community psychologist, and her work touched on a wide range of topics, including diversity, equity and inclusion, urban education, community organizing, and youth development. And this isn't Seema's first rodeo with FCYO. I think this is the 3rd report, Seema, that you've written with us, including our transforming young people and communities and data on the impacts of youth organizing. So Seema, really excited to have you here and to help share some of the key findings from this report.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Eric. And it's wonderful to be here with all of you today. So if you'll bear with me a minute, I'm just gonna share my screen. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes this afternoon sharing the highlights of our research and documenting the funder landscape. So the research actually includes 2 parts. The first part was a set of interviews with funders to really get their perspective on where we've been and where we're going. And then the second part was really looking at the data, the quantitative data, to get a sense of where the dollars are being invested in youth organizing. So I'm going to start with the qualitative, with the interview data, and really reinforce some of the themes that you heard from our amazing panel that just presented. So I'm going to highlight 3 themes that emerged out of the conversations that we had funders around the ways that philanthropy can really help strengthen the field of youth organizing. So the first is really investing in field infrastructure. And you heard, I think, both Sanjeev and Albert talk about this. So in recent years, we've seen funders like Ford provide support for organizations like FCYO, as well as regional and national collaboratives like Communities for Just Schools Fund and Alliance for Youth Organizing that have really strengthened the field nationally. And then you all heard Albert talk about the work in California and the investments that the California Endowment has made in statewide infrastructure organizations that have really helped youth organizing groups there become stronger and more networked. Second, related to strengthening field infrastructure and making investments there, youth organizing funders are also prioritizing leadership development and organizational capacity. Lori, touched on this in her comments. And this is something we've certainly seen from a whole host of funders. So folks like Cricket Island Foundation, Perrin Family Foundation, the Andrus Family Fund, and others have really done a great job thinking about capacity building and leadership development, building that pipeline in the field. And third, in the interviews, funders really noted that the field can be strengthened by recognizing and emphasizing how youth organizing intersects with other funding priorities. And again, I think the panelists did a great job talking about this. So that could be a specific issue area. It could be a commitment to youth development, a focus on equity, an interest in civic engagement and democracy. So I think, as Lori and others talked about, if you're a funder who's interested in climate justice, if you're a funder that's interested in gun violence, if you're a funder that's interested in immigrant rights, it's actually hard to imagine getting to the outcomes you want to see without tapping into the powerful movements that young people have built around these issues. Similarly, civic engagement, youth development are part and parcel of youth organizing, but this work often exists in silos. So within philanthropy, there are certainly opportunities to strengthen those connections to kind of really build the investment in youth organizing. So I'm going to shift now from these kind of big picture themes to get into the nitty-gritty of the data. The headline here is that there have been ebbs and flows in funding. Youth organizing has come a long way in the past 20 years, but there's still a long way to go. So as we dig into the funding data, I just want to say a quick word about the methodology with which I think Eric alluded to in his introduction, but there's really no single source of data on youth organizing funding. So the data that we're presenting here is really a patchwork of data from multiple sources. And while there are certainly limitations, this is the most comprehensive information we have to date on funding for youth organizing. And one of the nice things I think about this report is that I really hope it provides a baseline for future research on funding for youth organizing. So I don't want to get too wonky in this presentation, but if any of you all have questions about the methodology, about the data, I'm happy to take those offline or in the questions later. There's also more detail on the specifics in the report. But in the interest of time, I will share that we are essentially working with the universe of 312 youth organizing groups who were surveyed and for which we were able to get additional funding data through a number of other data sources. So through a supplemental budget survey, through data that FCYO collects through its funding map, and also from grant level data that we were able to get from Candid. So looking at all of this data together, we were able to estimate that in recent years, between the years of 2016 through 2019, the 312 groups in our sample collectively received between 169 million to 200 million annually for their youth organizing efforts. And this more or less is consistent with our finding that the average annual budget for youth organizing groups is around $546,000. So the takeaway here really is that groups are doing quite a lot with relatively small budgets. So most of the support for youth organizing groups comes from foundations. We actually identified 734 unique funders who had given grants of 10,000 or more to youth organizing groups in recent years. Some of you may find that number surprising, but I will say of those funders, the majority of these were small foundations that awarded 1 or 2 grants to organizations in their communities. But again, I think it signals that there's quite a bit of untapped potential among donors to be able to invest more in youth organizing to support the field. In terms of how these dollars are distributed, not surprisingly, most of the dollars are generally concentrated in California and the Northeast. So I know there's a lot of information on this slide. I'll let it sit for a minute, and it's also in the report if you want to reference, but this is not surprising because if you look at the next slide, you can see that funders are concentrated in the Northeast and California. So the patterns that we see really reflect where foundation donors are located. And I know we've talked already about some of the geographic disparities in rural areas. So one of the things that we looked at was funding by community type, and we were really able to attach some numbers to the disparities that we do see in rural areas. So rural areas on average had budgets of just under $200,000 for their work. And if you look at any other community type, whether it's a small city, a suburb, or a large city, those budgets were more in the 450 to 500,000 range. So you can see that disparity pretty starkly here. We also, when we surveyed organizations, we asked them about the kind of support that they received from funders versus the kind of support they desired from funders. And so there are a couple of things here that are interesting. If you look at introductions to other funders and rapid response funding for urgent needs, those are really the things that groups say that the kind of support that they would like to receive. And you can see that there's a little bit of disconnect in the support that they actually get in these areas from funders. So rapid response funding for urgent needs, for example, 71% of groups said that that's the kind of support they would like to see. And 33% said that's the support that they actually got. There was a little bit more alignment in 2 other areas. So looking at the extent to which funders facilitated connections to other youth organizations and the extent to which they supported organizational capacity building, there was, again, more alignment in what groups wanted and what funders were providing. And then finally, I just want to share a little bit of data around obstacles to securing funding. One of the things that almost half the group said that got in the way of securing resources was lack of development and grant writing capacity. Again, almost half said that funders don't necessarily understand organizing. Burdensome application procedures were also an issue for a number of groups. And then to a lesser extent, organizations being considered too political, too controversial, or budgets being too small were cited as obstacles. So the thing I think that's interesting here is that, at least looking at the first three, those are things that can be addressed, I think, with a little bit of creativity and innovation and self-reflection. So that's something certainly for funders to keep in mind. And so that is a very quick snapshot of the funding data. I'm happy to take questions, but I'm also, I also encourage folks to take a look at the report when you get a chance. There's a lot more detail there, so.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Seema, for going over the findings in the report. We will have a little, I think we definitely have a little bit of time. We'll come back and see if people have questions. So if you want to drop questions in the chat now, we'll come back in a couple of minutes and see if people have additional questions for Seema and for anyone else. So yeah, feel free to drop any questions that you have there. And so what we wanted to do now was to share some of our recommendations from FCYO. We have been engaged for 20 years in supporting this work. And these recommendations in some ways for today are going to be focused on funders. But before diving into that, part of the story that I want to make sure that we tell today is that, as I think folks know, there have been some real ebbs and flows in funding for youth organizing, right? When FCYO first started in the early 2000s, there was a certain amount of interest. There were some large funders that came to the table. Youth organizing was a new thing in philanthropy, and philanthropy loves a new thing, right? And then we saw right after 2008, a few years after the financial decline of 2008, we saw this major drop off, right? And some folks know that FCYO almost closed during that time period. Nat and Lori will remember FCYO board meetings that might have only been Nat and Lori, right? There were not a lot of funders supporting youth organizing in those years. We thought we, might be closing soon. The thing that I want to say to the youth organizers on the call, right, is that after 2015, we started to see increasing resources for youth organizing. And the reason for that, I believe, was not that we at FCYO made some kind of great case for youth organizing, or that we figured out the right argument to make for young people, or up to funders. It was the power of youth organizers that turned the tide, right? It was the work on the school to prison pipeline. It was the work of undocumented young people. It was the movement for Black lives. It was the power of youth organizers winning real things in their communities, organizing thousands of working class young people and young people of color, and having an impact that turned things around. And so that is for us the belief that the way, I don't know, right? The debate about the role of philanthropy and movements. What I know is that movements need resources, and that partnership between movements and organizers are really critical. So with that, I'm just gonna, let's see, get to our slides. And what we want to share briefly of, from 20 years of supporting this work, what have been some of our key lessons and recommendations from FCYO. So I will just share my screen again real quick. All right. So first off, and Sanjeev touched on this before, and we've said this before and we'll say it again, but youth organizing is at least a triple and maybe a quadruple bottom line investment, right? When you fund youth organizing, you get the impact on young people, the impact on whole communities, and the impact on a broader, more engaged citizenry. You know, there's not many other places where I think funders can see that kind of impact. And for a while, we may have only had the anecdotal evidence that that youth organizing supported the development of individual young people. We now have the research that shows that undoubtedly engaging young people in organizing is one of the best ways to support their holistic development. No question about that. So next, power is the key. Many years ago, some funders switched from seeing young people as having deficits to having assets. But we think now it's the time to recognize that to achieve the kind of changes we need, we have to support young people in building power. And for a lot of philanthropy, power is an uncomfortable word. It's easier to focus on some other more easily measurable outcomes. But the truth is that there's no way that we can address the kind of injustice that we see in the world without putting our focus solidly behind how to build the power to confront injustice and bring about the world that we want. And so this means that funders have to figure out how to prioritize that as the real goal. And that might mean challenging and changing some of the metrics that we're most used to using. Third, movements are intergenerational and young people are the spark. You know, when I first started in youth organizing, many of us were focused on building a youth movement. But more and more youth organizers have come to realize that really building transformative power requires intergenerational partnerships. And young people have always been at the forefront of social movements, but they've never been alone. And so one of the critical roles of young people in social movements is being the spark that galvanizes whole communities. So as funders come to understand youth organizing, we think it's critical to understand it as an integral part of healthy, sustainable, intergenerational social movements. Next, support young people advancing key issues, but also break the damn silos. Young people are at the forefront of addressing all of the most important pressing issues of our moment. You know, whether it's climate change, police accountability, immigration rights, gender justice, young people are leading the way. And so issue-based funders should understand that your issue does not have a future if you don't have a plan for how to engage young people. And the evidence is also quite clear that when funders do really engage young people in organizing, the results are tremendous. You know, look at school discipline, health, immigration. When issue-based funders have invested in young people as drivers of change, it works. But at the same time, we need funders to break those silos. The rent-a-youth organizer approach, where funders only support young people to work on a predetermined policy solution, that limits our long-term power. So we have to support young people who are at the forefront of these issues while also allowing the flexibility to allow them to determine the solutions and build intersectional movements. That's what we know is really needed. Next, get funding where it's needed most, right? One of the biggest challenges is that money is not necessarily getting where it's most needed. Seema talked about the data about the regional disparities and the gaps in supporting rural communities. You know, we've seen after events like Parkland and in the climate movement, where lots of money flows to majority white youth organizations, but is not getting to young people of color who've been working on those same issues for years, right? That is not okay. Similarly, in the influx of resources that got committed to racial justice, like after the summer of 2020, very little of that actually went to the working class Black young people who were on the forefront and front lines of demanding that change. So we have to figure out how to get money and resources to the young people who are on the front lines of these issues. 6, this is long haul work and become co-conspirators. We know that youth organizing is capable of incredible results, but funders shouldn't expect short-term miracles. This is a long-term commitment, and that means providing long-term unrestricted funding. It also means sitting down and developing real partnerships with youth organizers, right? Some folks like to say that funders should move resources and get out of the way, right? We hear that in movement spaces a lot. But I actually think one of the biggest lessons from 20 years at FCYO is that we need real partnerships between funders and organizers, right? We need funding strategies that are aligned with movement strategies. And so that means that funders and organizers have to really sit down together and strategize. We have to challenge power imbalances, but it doesn't mean just showing up and going away. It means showing up, sitting down and working through the hard issues and figuring out how do we together strategize to get movement strategies and funding strategies that are in alignment with each other. Right. And last, I just again want to say that we're in a really pivotal moment, right? Our country in this moment is either going to move towards justice or greater fear and repression. In order to address the threats and the opportunities of this moment, we need the leadership of young people, and we all have to level up, right? Organizers have to look at how to build real, meaningful power that can address the kind of challenges we're facing in this moment. And I think youth organizers are doing that across the country now, right? But funders also have to level up. And that means being willing to take risks and make sure that young people really have the resources that they need in this moment. So those are a few of the lessons that I think that we have gathered at FCYO from the work that we've been doing. I'll stop our share right now, the screen share right now, and again turn to see if there are questions. If you have questions for Seema about the data, for us at FCYO about our lessons, from our other presenters, we have a few minutes where we can address some of our questions before we close out today. But again, just really want to appreciate everybody for being on and for joining in this conversation. So I will, I'll check back in with my colleagues at FCYO. See if there's any questions. So yeah, folks in the room, you can raise your hand if you have a question that you want to address, or you can drop it in the chat here. But what has sparked your interest today? What further questions do you have? And what else would you like to know about how we have supported youth organizing collectively over these last 20 years and where we're going in the years to come? What I will do and see if there's other questions that are coming up, and I see a lot of great, comments from the chat. Let me just turn to I co-host and other presenters here. We have a couple minutes left while we see if there's other questions that come in via the chat, or if other folks want to. You can also use the raise your hand feature if you have a question that you want to drop in. But let me just check in with my co-host Monica and with our other presenters. Are there things from our other speakers here, Sanjeev, Albert, Lori, and Nat, and Seema? Are there things that you heard from each other, things that sparked your attention that you wanted to respond to? Anything that sparked your interest and that you want to bring us back to?
I would really love to go back to some of what Sanjeev was talking about in terms of that this is beyond people. It is about people. It is beyond issues, and it is about issues, but you have to center it in the people to get the durability of wins in the issues. And I also think that it's also about the scope of change that you're looking for, right? Is the scope of change single issue? Do you really think that that's how social justice is achieved? Because I don't, right? We don't live in single issue worlds, right? Every issue, that's the whole point of structural racism. Every issue is embedded in every other issue. So by centering in people, right, it's another way also of thinking about the value of youth organizing. One of the things people always say, right, is children are our future. I think youth organizing proves that children are the present and the power of the present, and they will be here longer than we will. That is simply true. They will be in leadership positions, and we must make that possible. And that's another piece of the centering in people. Like, we think about that how organizations internally do that work as being critically important in our decision making and in our understanding of youth organizing. In other words, are young people in decision making powerful positions even within those organizations, and are the organizations accountable to those young people? So I just wanted to bring back that thought, because I've been sort of stewing over that. What does it mean to be about people rather than issues? It's not even just like issues are isolated, but it's even bigger than that, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Lori. Nat, I see you got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise this kind of lexicon type of thing. So when we talk about youth organizing, part of we were talking earlier about kind of social justice organizers as well as social justice philanthropy, marginalizing it because, you know, they saw youth organizing as a kind of niche because young people only, you know, can do stuff around education or maybe juvenile justice or things like that. And there was a spot around, I think 2005, 2006, where, you know, within SBYO and the broader field, we started talking about youth organizing issues as community issues, right? That you cannot, there's no separation there, right? And so I think as we look to broaden the gaze of philanthropy, to see the essential role that young people can do and will play in moving forward the agenda for change, whatever those are, the agenda for change in this country, we also have to make the kind of mental kind of adjustment to say that when we're talking about youth organizing, we are talking about a constituency that is necessary as core infrastructure, not like these little niche issues, right? Because we need folks, young people's power across all these issues.
Thank you. Yeah, Sanjeev.
Thanks. You know, one of the things I'm sitting with, and I'm also appreciating James's question in the chat about, you know, youth organizing and youth development, but I'll respond to that in the chat. But one thing I'm sitting with and hearing other people talk, and also just the reference to power and power building, I think that's really true. And I think we all, funders, field, youth organizers, but not only youth organizing, we have some work to do around what that means, right? What does power building mean? Building a base is one thing, having governing power is another. And so just getting, I think, in the way that the articulation of youth organizing as a field has really leveled up attention and focus on it, I think the next horizon of work is around getting sharper on power and power building, because the other side actually has a really clear view of what power means. And that's not actually what our view is, but we need to have our own view. So that's one thing I'm sitting with. And then the other is just, there is a real, like from a governing perspective, what is the inside outside strategy that we can be more effective partners on the philanthropic side to youth-led organizations in advancing governing priorities, not just demand priorities. And we have work to do on the philanthropy side, because I actually think the field, as others have said, is much further along than funders are. So I'll just leave it there.
That's great. Thank you, Sanjeev. Let me just check. Albert and Seema, are there final responses that either of you want to bring in? I know that there's been a couple of questions. This idea of funders and youth organizers as co-conspirators and co-strategists. What are the examples of that? I love that people are right. Like, where do we see that? So that's a great question that's coming up. I hope that's what we're trying to do here at FCYO. That's what we see as part of our work. I know it's happened in other places like the Movement for Black Lives for sure, right? Around the resourcing strategies there. But so let me just check. Albert and Seema, are there?
Yeah, I'll be super brief, Eric. One quick example that comes to mind. I saw Luis Sanchez here. I think the creation of Power California is an example of co-conspiracy between community partners and philanthropy. One other thing that I wanted to say, I think Sanjeev was right about when we think about the dynamics of building and wielding power. What does that really entail? How do we support our partners for success? But the question that I'm most intrigued by is the nuances between youth development and youth organizing. I often think about, as Lori pointed out in the chat, I agree with Lori's initial assessment. I also think, as you know, in some ways, we have the schools work, but when we're thinking about out of school time and we're thinking about community time and we're thinking about a system and a practice at scale, I think oftentimes our young people are talking about, our youth organizers are talking about youth development opportunities available at scale in local communities. And I argue that that's kind of the antithesis of the punitive system, right? Like we have a public punitive system, a justice system targeted young people. We don't have scalable youth development systems locally and statewide. Here in LA, our young people recently fought to establish a youth development, a city and county youth development department. We actually don't have them in the city of LA. And our youth organizers have been behind that. And they're really saying that's the place for youth jobs, arts, like in small communities. So I think there's a relationship between youth organizers fighting for youth development at scale when we think about systems of opportunity while we're dismantling systems of oppression. So those are some thoughts that are bubbling up for me.
That's great. Thank you, Albert. Thanks for complicating that, right? I mean, if folks haven't seen the early FCYO resources about the youth engagement continuum that talk about that relationship between organizing, youth voice, youth development, but I think that's a really important way to complicate that notion. We're approaching our time. Seema just wanted to check if there's any last responses that you wanted to add into this, and then I will turn it over to Monica to close us out.
No, I think I'm all set. I know there were some questions about youth development, youth organizing, and the connection between the two. So I just want to, again, point folks to some of the papers that FCYO has published. I know Kel included some of the links, but I think there's a lot of good data there for folks to check out and make those connections.
All right. Excellent. So I am going to turn it over to Monica to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Am I on mute? No. Okay, good. I was like, am I on mute? Story of our lives the last year, correct? I was so happy to see this conversation moving towards a bigger conversation around power, what that means, and the relationship between philanthropy and the field and movement work and funding it. I'm dropping this. This is how FCYO has been really thinking about our role within the broader ecosystem in supporting organizing efforts to build the power to win. So I'm dropping just like what we have been functioning, as a working definition of how we understand the power that we need to build and our role in trying to support organizing that is working in that direction. And I say all that because if some of this conversation, if threads of this conversation interest you or excited you or you want more, please come back with us to our conversation on May 20th. So again, May 20th, you can still register 11 Eastern to 2:30. We're going to both be bringing in youth organizers and young people within those organizations for opportunities for smaller group conversations and really getting into the depths of these conversations and the history of the work and where we've grown and the actual data of not just the funder scan, what we talked about today, but the field scan data. So really, these are going to build upon each other and we hope you all return back. For funders who this also sparks something for you and you're like, yeah, I want to align my strategies like that, or I want to experiment or try something on. We're excited to have conversations with you. We have some very exciting opportunities coming down the pipe. And if you want to hear more about those, please reach out to us. You'll definitely hear more about them soon, but we're happy to have more one-on-one conversations with folks and funders who are really trying to lean into this kind of way of philanthropic giving and partnership. And then for the field, also want you to keep an eye out for emails from FCYO. We'll have some new, we'll be rolling out a new 3-tier grant making program, and we'll have some new opportunities for you as well. So excited to continue to be in partnership with everybody here and continue to grapple and struggle with how we build the power to win. Thank you all.